I think that our world is really like a spider web. And when we touch one part of it, the whole thing can wiggle. And touching one part of it could be eliminating a species from it.
And they dropped a net off a bridge, and he flipped over, slid underneath it, and rolled up. And I was like, oh, that is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And I was thinking about that when I saw that kayak.
Yeah.
And I went, I'll trade you some of this job for that kayak.
The tug is a drug. I mean, I got the tug, and I was just, I probably set the hook so hard that the fish flew behind us. I have no idea, but I was so excited to put fly tying together with the fly fishing.
Fall in love with the river. Fall in love with disconnecting. Fall in love with the sounds that we're hearing in the background. Connect, and all the fish are the bonus after that.
Welcome to the Flyline Podcast, where we enjoy the interesting stories behind the legendary guides and luminaries connected to Maine fishing. I'm Michael Jones. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome a very special guest, Leslie Hilyard. Leslie Hilyard has dedicated much of his life to preserving the rich history of Maine fly fishing, particularly the legacy of renowned fly tyer Carrie Stevens. Leslie's journey began with family vacations to Rangeley, where his father, Robert Graydon Hilyard, exposed Leslie to the world of Maine fly fishing. Over time, what started as a shared family pastime grew into a deep passion for documenting and preserving Carrie Stevens' work. In this episode, Leslie takes us back to those early days, sharing how his father's fascination with fly fishing history shaped their family's connection to the sport. Leslie recounts some of the early history of Upper Dam and the characters and life in that area, and the meticulous process of researching and authenticating Carrie Stevens' iconic flies. Leslie also opens up about the personal inspirations that inspired him and his father to channel their curiosity into writing a comprehensive book on Stevens' work. Along the way, we'll learn about their relationships with other influential figures in the fly fishing world, like the Palmers and the founders of the Outdoor Heritage Museum in Aquasic, Maine, and how those connections helped them acquire and preserve valuable artifacts and learn deeper insights into the preservation of Maine fly fishing history. Outside of his work preserving this legacy, Leslie has had a diverse career as a flooring preservation contractor and a chef. Experiences that he reveals have enriched his life and perspective in unexpected ways. His reflections on Carrie Stevens' enduring contributions to fly tying and her influence on the sport as a whole are both thoughtful and inspiring. It comes with great gratification and appreciation that I introduce this episode's guest, Leslie Hilyard. Leslie, welcome to the Flyline Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. This is my first ever podcast.
I'm surprised to hear it because you and your father had created an indelible mark in the Rangeley fly fishing history, and you've spent really a lot of your time and energy in doing chronology work. Carrie Stevens, and of course, Herbie Welch, which is what we want to talk about in this conversation. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join the Flyline Podcast audience and share some of the stories, because only you could tell them.
No, it's my pleasure to have you here.
Yeah.
We're at Haynes Landing. Our listeners should know. We're in Camp Meeting, which is the old frontline camp built in 1898. I'm glad I got the chill enough out of here today. It's awful cold.
We're sitting by a crackling fire.
Yes, I'm going to get a little closer to it. It would suit me.
Tell me about the structure.
Well, there was a grand hotel here, as so many of the lakes supported multiple hotels back in the day, starting around the turn of the last century. And this was the Mooslick McGuntick House, which is about 50 yards away.
Mm-hmm.
And after they established the hotel, they had some push for people that wanted to be here and have the amenities of the hotel at their disposal, i.e. the dining room and all the guide service and all that. But they wanted a little bit of their own space, not so much the communal hotel style living. So they started to build these cabins, and there were 5 original cabins. And this cabin here is part of the remaining 3 original camps with this long conjoined porch, which was just those were lovely, very communal. But at the end of the day, and we still do this.
Yeah.
Pipes, cigars will be smoked on the porch, and scotch and wine will be drank
Overlooking the lake.
overlooking the lake.
So it's really the,
Watching the kids.
the quintessential Maine sporting camp. We just,
Yeah, it still works here. It's still, the Route 4 ends right here, and there's the public boat launch. And it's very much it's a busy working spot. People come here to fish. It's not just no one's doing it for the Instagram and just hanging out. There's goals here. Relaxation is certainly one of them, and that's important too. But, Moosook-Maganek maintains a strong fishing community.
and that's been going on for 150 to 100,
Yeah, we're getting on there now.
right?
So Upper Dam, oh, Father, forgive me. Once they constructed Upper Dam and they essentially formed the pool at the top of the Richardson, the trout were massive, and word got out. The famous fish that George Shepard Page brought back to Harvard for Louis Agassiz to analyze and to finally put to bed that long time angling war between the Adirondacks and the Rangeleys. The founders of the fishing guild over in the Adirondacks were convinced that this was not a true brook trout. It was too big. It's not a true trout. You're just heathens. And you don't know what you're talking about. Well, Agassiz put that to bed. This is the true Salvelinus fontinalis. This is the true brook trout char. And although they had that same trout in the Adirondacks, they were just sadly smaller.
Yeah. I love it.
Too bad.
Yeah.
Even then it mattered.
Yeah.
Bragging rights.
I understand your father passed in 2020 in April.
Mhm.
Tell us about your dad.
Well, his pen name was Graydon R. Hilyard, and that's what he wrote under. But his real name was Robert. That's the R. And his middle name is Graydon. And he was born in Fort Fairfield, Maine in 1944. Way up. Yeah. To Sewell and Audrey Hilyard. Sewell was a Reformed Baptist minister. And
Reformed.
Reformed Baptist.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you made reference to camp meeting.
Yes. So father was raised in church along with his brother, Gerald, and both of them did not go into the clergy, as was the thing. They were the first Hilyard men to not go into the clergy in a long time. There were generations of ministers.
So what did your dad do?
Well, he and my uncle both went into psych.
Oh, psychiatry.
Which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But that's how he made his way in the world, doing that. And they moved around a lot, wherever my grandfather was called to serve the people. And camp meeting, the name of this camp, is a Baptist term. You would have meeting, you would have camp meeting. And there would be, revivals and the big baptismals, and everyone would come and gather, and there were the camp grounds. You hear that term a lot in the gospel work.
So what was the spark that lit inside your father to start studying some of the history of Rangeley, in particular Carrie Stevens?
Well,
do you remember that time in your
sure,
when that happened?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Can you share with that?
My father was a historian at heart, and he always said that as a young man, he spent the first 18 years of his life trying to get out of the state of Maine, right? Because who wants to stay around? And then he spent every year since trying to get back. And when I was about 12, we decided we were going to take a family vacation, and we were going to go to Rangeley, Maine. Now, as a boy, I had been reading everything I could get my hands on about fishing. I'd been fishing all my life, spin fishing, but I'd only been fly fishing for a couple of years. And, everything I read, Bates, all his books, every issue of Field and Stream that came out, Taps, Tips, I couldn't get through the month without it. All that stuff invariably came around to the Rangers, the land of fishing legends, as it was called, right? And so he said we were going to the Rangers, and my mother was like, sure, get me out of town, will you? And I was like, let's go.
When was this, do you think?
It was 1981.
Yeah. Early 80s.
Yep.
Yeah.
1981.
And was your father a fly fisherman at that point?
He had just started.
Yeah, sure.
So I came first with the fly fishing, which is kind of weird. But so we got here, and kind of a typical trip to a place you'd never been before. Got in a little late. Parents were really, had enough of being in the car. Could really use a cigarette, a cup of coffee. So we're unloading at this little camp. We stayed in Rangeley at Russell's Motor Lodge. It no longer exists, but it was, small camps on the water. And I was like, are we done? And my mother's like, we should just go fishing. Just get out of here because you're killing me. And so I grabbed my rod and I ran around to the first dock. And Cass, it's dark now. It's just like, because we came in so late. And I caught a brook trout right away. A little Meps, Black Fury. Love that spirit. And that was it.
Yeah.
And that was it. And then, we came back to Rangeley every year after that. And you don't spend any appreciable amount of time here fishing without learning about Carrie Stevens right away.
Right.
And I'd known of her vaguely through my reading, but I hadn't become the rabid fly tyer that I would become shortly.
So tell us about the conversation that must have happened between that point and ultimately publishing the book, where you and your father started to have dialogue about, hey, we think there's an opportunity to do some historical work here.
It didn't really go that way.
Yeah, tell us how it went.
So we got fascinated with this stuff and with her and her work and her name. And my parents were very serious antique collectors in all forms, Victorian jewelry and furniture and literature and all manner of things.
Mm-hmm.
So wherever they went, there was like, hey, what's cool here? What's beautiful? Folk art was really important to them. And fly tying largely comes under the heading of folk art.
Of course.
It's a beautiful craft that is often artfully done. And this was more Dad's thing. He wanted to have some of her work.
Mm-hmm.
So we started rooting around, and Dick Frost from the Rangeley Region Sports Shop.
Yeah.
We became friendly with him. This is a couple years in now, and they, some flies came our way, the first in our collection of Mrs. Stevens. And it was fascinating.
Mm.
And we wanted to learn more and more about her. And we started talking to more and more people. And over the years, you're winning trust, and your doors are opening. Father was from Maine, which matters a lot.
Your father was from Maine.
Yes.
Right. So he had that heritage, and he had that.
Yeah. Because otherwise we're just, jerks from Massachusetts. And there's less of that today in the state of Maine. Less of it.
Yeah.
But back then, people would just be like, no, I'm not really interested in sharing, because people were private. But him being from Maine opened a lot of doors. And then all of a sudden, people started reaching out to us with questions. So we were no longer just asking questions. We were also able to finally provide answers.
You're becoming authority figures on Carrie Stevens.
We kind of started to know a little bit more than other folks. And, this is purely fun, right? This is just cool. We're really into it. And that transition from, neophyte to an authority is really subtle. You don't really see it happening. You just are able to answer a question finally. And then we're having a lot of fun with that. And our collection started to grow and grow and grow of physical pieces. And we met more and more people that knew her at Upper Dam, where we fished a lot. The real impetus for turning that into any kind of physical writing was the passing of my mother. She died very unexpectedly in 96.
Tell us about your mother.
Her name was Pauline Adeline.
Mm-hmm. And how does she pass so quickly? If we can.
Oh, sure. So essentially she threw a clot, and it traveled. It started in her leg, and just shut it down. Yeah. So it was only a few hours between that happening and actually making the decision that she should be taken off life support.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, thank you very much. But
this had a great effect on your father.
It did. It was incredibly saddening. My mother was the center of our family. At the time, there were six. There's 6 of us, children, and mom was True matriarch.
Yeah.
And my father was profoundly devastated by the loss. My mother was 13 years my father's senior.
Oh,
And she had 5 children when she met him.
oh, wow.
Right.
Are you the only offspring between your?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Got there pretty quick.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
unique. Huh?
Yeah. So they fell in love hard.
Yeah.
And she had gone through a terrible divorce, and she was the love of his life.
Hmm.
And he needed to channel this grief.
I was going to use the word channel.
Yeah, you have to
Yep.
channel grief.
Yep.
You know, it doesn't go away, but you can use it and you can manipulate it. And you can, on our best days of handling grief, we come to terms with it. Get over it so much as you get on with it. And that's what this was. It was a very cathartic process for him to be able to channel this and to have a goal, have a purpose.
Did he come out and say to you, I think we should write this book?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. That's pretty much how it went down. He's like, I think I want to do this. What do you think? And I said, I think we can.
Right.
And we certainly got access at this time. We were lifelong friends with the Palmers in Rangeley,
Which
Don
is to
and
say Don
Stephanie,
and Stephanie
Palmer.
Yeah. Who are really antique collectors, and they have an antique shop, Blueberry Hill Antiques.
They did? Yep.
Yeah.
They sure
And they
did.
were early on with the museum in Aquasic for the Sporting Heritage Museum.
Mhm.
Right. I'm sorry to
No.
just want to, for the audience, clarify who Don is.
No, well, Don, Don, a little bit after us, got really interested in Carrie Stevens.
Yeah.
And Don was he was the master curator of these things.
Yeah.
And people loved Don, and Don had a real soft sell. He was not pushy. He would play a fly sale for 5 years until that person was ready to go.
Mhm.
Really, really cool about it.
First time I saw White Nose Pete, it was sitting in Don's hands.
Yeah.
So that's very iconic piece.
Oh my gosh.
We could
Wonderful
have a
cover.
podcast about that alone.
Oh
but
my God. I'll talk about Shang Wheeler any day.
yeah, this is so great. I really appreciate you, Tim.
Shang
This
was
is
amazing.
great stuff.
But let me go back to Don. Don had been acquiring Carrie Stevens flies as well. Now we're friends, but we're also competitors now. So who gets there first, right? On the fly. So these things would happen. And when someone would come to Father and I, and they'd have this collection. But this wallet came to light from this man whose name was Mallory, his last name. And in it were dozens and dozens and dozens of Carrie Stevens streamers, that some of which we had never seen, and this really prominent collection came to light. So through mutual friends, he was able to reach out to Father and I, and we went and reviewed it out in Princeton, Mass. And the subject of price came up, and it, blew us out of the water. So what do? You call Don, because Don had pockets, right?
Yeah,
Don
sure.
had did very well for himself.
Right.
His family, he was an executive at Gillette. Turned down the vice presidency of Europe's division to stay here and move to Maine and do, he just didn't see that commute adding anything to his life. He was very serious about it. So
No, and he and Stephanie were here really before the real estate boom happened. They had established themselves in the area. They were a known entity, and they were definitely some of the first people to go into the traditional sporting camps and private camps and see a Herb Welch trout on the wall or a
Nash.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mallard,
Nash.
and be able to pull that off the wall before it got thrown on the dump.
Yeah. Some of that happened over the years, but, Don and Stephanie were really good at preservation. And that's a really important distinction. They didn't just go find these artifacts because they wanted them. They saw the value in as hallmarks of the region.
And your father did as well.
My father did as well.
Yeah. So your father talks in the introduction of the Carrie Stevens book, which I just reread recently in anticipation of this conversation. And he talks about the different degrees of provenance of the Carrie Stevens flies. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So to determine if anything is real, bona fide, whatever it is, but particularly in flies, you have to understand the style in which this object is made, whether that's a Tiffany lamp or a Fabergé egg. Other people can come really close, but the true innovator is going to have some very specific tells, if you will. And Carrie Stevens is really no different than that. So everybody focuses on the banded hem. And that's cool because, 98% of the time she did band for flies' heads. She didn't always. So what else did you got? Well, she always tied with the left-hand wrap. So if the ribbing on that body of that fly is not going in the appropriate direction, it's not her work. That is really the only super true
those are the dead giveaways, right?
method.
Yeah.
The ribbing and the direction of her body wraps is the one thing that I've never found any variation in. All the other aspects of the design can, maybe I only have a really short golden pheasant crest here to use. I'm running out. The war's on. I can't get stuff, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is a good example because people for years thought that the gray ghost had a tail, but instead of tying in a long, beautiful golden pheasant crest up towards the head of the fly that would drape along the body, the only place that feather is generally visible is towards the tail area of a fly at the bend of the hook. So if she was left with a really short piece, she would tie it in way back there. Yep. So that little flash of yellow still works, right? So there's something you need to know.
Mm-hmm.
The materials that she used, these are telling as well. Most people use bucktail today for the underbelly of the fly. Well, she preferred goat.
Oh,
right. It's a much better hair. So she would use that, but she would also use bucktail if she didn't have any good goat.
Yeah.
She would use jungle cock. She glued her shoulders and her cheeks together.
Mm-hmm.
And she often glued the whole wing assembly together, but not always. And then sometimes the fly is actually mounted on a card that has her name on it and has her handwriting on it. So those are the bonds. I mean, you don't need me for that,
right.
As long as I understand her handwriting.
What is the high water mark of a Carrie Stevens fly now? So it's carded, it's probably in cellophane, it's numbered, it's a pattern.
If you've got a carded fly in cellophane and it's in good condition, that's pretty much where you want to live. Now, those are at the top of the scale of price, right?
Yes.
I was just moving a bit of a collection, and we had the opportunity to sell one of her extremely early pieces. Her early works were not named, and she didn't have the Water Witch and the Gray Ghost and, the Kelly's Killer, all those wonderful names.
They were numbered.
Yeah. It's like, okay, well, she had little stamps.
Yeah.
She'd ink them and stamp them on the card. And we were, as far as we know, the highest number we have seen on a carded fly is a 53. It's a very straightforward 2-feather wing, grizzly feather dyed orange, a little white bucktail underneath that.
It was number 53.
That was the 53. And we were just able to sell out of a collection a number 1.
Right.
The very first marketed pattern that she had.
So when I was doing my research and also just enjoying the read again, because the original Carrie Stevens book that you and your father published was in 2000. And you are responsible for doing a lot of the tying in that book, or some of the tying in that book, to show some of these patterns. So you might have had a recipe, but you didn't have an original pattern, but you could, like making a batch of brownies, you could say a cup of flour, sugar. You could look and say, this is how this fly was probably constructed. And you were contributing to the book in this. Do I have that right?
Yep. A lot of the flies. So you've got a fly and all its components are there, but it's visually unacceptable.
Right.
Yeah.
And
we had there was a debate on whether we should still use that fly, but we had 90 odd flies of hers, of patterns. And we had so many that were in such wonderful condition from her hand that we felt we weren't slighting our readers by showing a better version of that particular pattern.
No.
So the fly tyers could understand and replicate it. And I luckily was a fly tyer.
So let's talk about your fly tying.
Sure.
Do you still tie in the tradition of Carrie Stevens without a vise, or
I do not. I do not. And there's a very, very, very simple reason for that. My flies are not as good in my own hand.
but you've tried it?
I have, and I can do it.
Yeah.
I don't find it particularly enjoyable.
No.
And they lack. But the construction method that she came up with was kind of fascinating because tying in the hand Carrie Stevens did not invent that. No more than she actually invented the streamer. She gave us our modern format for that. But European Atlantic salmon tyers, to be specific, had tied in the hand for generations.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that there's been a lot of conversation that people like to say that Carrie Stevens invented the modern streamer, but it really is just an offshoot of what people were already doing ahead of her.
Yeah, so
the Doc Scott and
the development of the streamer is kind of an interesting thing, and it's vague. Well, like all those topics, there's some very specific points that you can extrapolate sometimes a little bit too much information from, and then there's a lot of vague thing. The term streamer, for one, in Europe, long hackles were called streamers. So I wouldn't say, give me that blue hackle. I'd say, hand me that blue streamer. And there's this transition period where flies were tied on short shanks, like 3X or lake fly versions, the bigger ones that they would use at the turn of the century, big Montreals and, palm bells and all those. But they still had gut, eyes on and leaders. The term's escaping me. It's not good. Snouts.
snell hooks.
Snell.
Correct.
So you have the short shank, and then they started to put really long feathers on them instead of just tying like big bugs, and those were called streamers, and
In particular, casting streamers.
for casting,
Right.
yeah,
Versus trolling.
not so much for trolling,
Exactly.
And they caught on that it's a bait fish, it's silhouette, it's size, it's shape. The fish sees that and says that's something I want to eat. So that whole streamer development thing, it's very hard to tie a fly today and a feather wing streamer, and not be able to find a little bit of Carrie Stevens methods in it. Even if you're not gluing hackles or anything like that, just the sense of proportion, material selection, all those things. She developed all that, and she raised that whole craft, arguably, to an art form.
Right. So as I'm looking here in the early part of the book, Carrie Stevens, really the Gray Ghost was designed to imitate what?
Smelt.
Right. And so a smelt is not an inch long. It's about maybe 3, 4, 5 inches long.
Oh, back then, even bigger after they stocked them, because they're an introduced species around here, we managed to kill all the blueback trout, which is what got these trout, the brook trout, to such a massive size. They're just little protein packs, like tuna on mackerel. But after the smelt was in, you could get, you've heard the term jack smelt.
Yep.
You get a big one.
Yep.
We've started to see them again out here on Mooselook in the evening. You'll see that large area of dimpling. We're seeing massive bait structure out here again, which is really super, super good. That's been a bone of contention. We've got a lot of 15-inch salmon in this lake.
Yeah. Maybe too many.
Right. And they say, well, please take, I don't know, was it 2 a day or whatever?
Sure.
And who wants to kill that fish?
Right.
Nobody wants to kill that fish. His eyes are big.
The biologist wants you to kill them.
They'd love to, yeah. And she would tie those flies on large 10X hooks. Those are probably her most recognizable works.
Yep.
And those can be, 3.5 inches long.
What did you guys find about her sourcing material in terms of her hooks in particular? Where was she? Do you know where she was getting her hooks from when she was a commercial, when she was in her heyday?
Yeah, it was actually local. So, we had talked about Dick and Joan Frost owning the Ranger Region Sports Shop in Rangeley. Well, years before that, there was a man named George Fletcher who owned the shop. And George just happened to own it when Carrie Stevens was doing her thing. And he became her feather merchant by and large. And Alcock hooks, her preferred hook, he sold them.
From England,
yeah.
Right.
And right around 1940 or 39, somebody came to George and said, the war's coming and you better buy. because you know what happens during wartime. All the metallurgy places get shifted to the war machine, right?
Yes.
So you may be making hooks today, but you're going to be making shell casings tomorrow because, you know, you have.
Thanks for sharing that. That's
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sad, but true. So she loved these hooks, as did the entire industry. I mean, Alcar, you know, the Percy collection, 99% of those hooks are Alcar hooks.
They're really high quality.
Oh, super high quality.
They're really stiff steel.
Really just
And
wonderful bronze work. And
when tied correctly, they can last for generations.
they do.
And
I have flies in my wallet that are 40 years old that I fish that are on those hooks. And the problem is never the hook.
Right.
That is not true today.
So I think what you were going to say was that Carrie and maybe the local vendors really loaded up on inventory.
Yeah, George got wise, and he purchased, like, you know, I don't know how you get gross upon gross of hooks.
Sure.
And so she was never without them.
Yeah.
Those are a few examples of her tying on Mustad hooks and Willis hooks, who were also out of Redditch, England.
Okay.
Yeah, they were through those, but those Alcock hooks are they're also highly, highly coveted. I've seen a box of Alcock 1810s go for over $200.
And what's a box consist of?
100 hooks.
Wow. Yeah.
So, you know, $2 a hook is not a lot of money.
No.
When you think about it, but you don't have to spend that.
Well, I think I pay almost that for my partridge Carrie Stevens I don't even know if they're still producing those, but let's go back to the book, because I think one of the things that I think is this podcast is about you, although we're talking so much about Carrie Stevens. What happened after you and your father released the book with Stackpole? It exploded. It was widely, it was highly regarded and widely regarded.
It really shocked us.
Yeah, surprisingly.
No, it shocked the publisher as well. The book was never supposed to really work. They didn't like it. They didn't like the format. They didn't like the concept of this biography coupled with a manual, a how-to. It had not been done. And I'm not exactly sure what the tipping point was for Stackpole. There was a wonderful woman there at the time named Judith Schnell, and she was our person.
Mm-hmm.
And she became a believer. And they went forward with it. And, you know, the Hook and Bullet publishing world was really different then in 2000. And the first release, it came out I remember we had a big signing in January at the Marlboro Fly Fishing Show. And she met us there with 100 cases of books. And first printing was 3,000 copies. And we went through 4 printings that year.
That's right.
We had no idea.
We were buying,
and you know, we knew people were interested in this topic, but we were unprepared for that, for the level of this rabid consumption of her work.
Well, you guys were stepping in at a time when the industry was booming because of a river runs through it and everyone wanted to try fly fishing.
Yeah.
And the next thing that happens after you start really getting into anything is you start trying to dig into history. And you and your father stepped right in and put in the number. You brought in the Carl Yastrzemski of the fly tying world and told the whole story and showed the recipes, right? Which was another part of it, because people that were getting into fly tying were interested in, well, of course, there's a gray ghost, but what else is there?
Mm-hmm.
But you did a great job.
Thanks.
The first book, which is the Carrie Stevens book,
fun.
is really only the beginning of the story of what you and your father did. And so I think it's a good time to take a break. And we'll come back in the second half, and I want to talk about Herb Welch, and I want to talk about the Percy
Tackle Cup.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
In this Flyline flashback, we focus on the iconic story of White Nose Pete. The story of White Nose Pete emerged around 1897, centered on a mythical giant brook trout, was said to live in the Upper Dam Pool connecting Moosuc-Magunnick Lake with what we now call Upper Richardson Lake. This tale enchanted anglers in the Rangeley Lakes region for generations. The legend gained new life when Charles Wheeler, known to his friends as Shang Wheeler, crafted a wood carving of Pete's enormous head. The carving, adorned with flies lost by unlucky anglers, embodied the elusive trout's mystique. In addition, Wheeler penned a poem and added an illustration of White-Nosed Pete above it, creating a tribute that captured the imagination of the fishing community. Shang Wheeler wasn't just a master carver, he was a 12-time amateur champion in the International Decoy Makers Contest in New York City. He was also a close friend of Wallace and Carrie Stevens. Together, the trio played a playful hoax, spinning the white-nosed Pete tail to prank Captain Joseph Bates, one of Wallace's regular fishing clients. In 1923, Wheeler gifted the carving in tribute poem to Wallace Stevens. Remarkably, this was one of only a few fish carvings completed by Wheeler. It featured a unique Carrie Stevens reverse-tied bucktail fly, a one-of-a-kind piece in its own right, alongside other flies captured in Pete's mythical maw. For years, the carving and its legend floated around Upper Dam before finding a permanent home. Today, these artifacts, along with the story of White-Nosed Pete, are proudly displayed at the Outdoor Heritage Museum in Aquasic, Maine. And now, back to the second half of our episode.
So one of my favorite things about Carrie Stevens' work is how she would come to name flies, and some of them were named after people. She had a great friend, G. Donald Bartlett, who was a guest at the Upper Dam House Hotel, and they were very close. And she named the fly the G. Donald Bartlett, the Dawn's Delight, the Dawn's Special. They were very close, and he had these flies. And then other ones, like the one she named after her darling Cocker Spaniel, Happy Garrison. Well, the other thing that drives the collecting is finding flies, right? But you can often find a fly, and we don't know the pattern name.
So you know it's a Carrie Stevens fly.
Unequivocally. These are her materials. The era is right. It might be with another batch of her work, the style, all of it. This is a Carrie fly. No reference, no card, nothing written down in the wallet.
So is somebody a specialist at this?
There is a specialist in this. His name is Peter Simonson. And Peter is a brilliant fly tyer. And he actually has compiled a database because he's a nerd's nerd on this stuff. He is done an incredible amount of research and documentation on these unknown patterns. And it's online. Forgive me for not knowing how to access it, but his name is Peter Simonson.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a beautiful write-up in Fly Tyer last year, a cover article about just about this topic.
The topic of Carrie Stevens flies that
are
unrecognized,
that are unknown. We call them unknowns.
I love it.
Tomb of the Unknown Fly.
I love it.
And some of them are stunningly beautiful and are so complex and beautifully layered and an incredible baitfish imitation. You just look at them and you're like, holy mackerel, that is a catching pattern, right?
Yeah.
So we duplicate the patterns, but we dare not name them. And I've taken great issue with this with other people in the past, other historians and researchers who will attribute a name to a fly. And the big problem with that, I mean, you want to be able to identify it at least in your own mind. But when that comes out into the common world, those names, people just accept those names.
And they shouldn't do that.
And it's not the name.
It's not.
It's not the name.
Or the number.
I mean, before I met you, I just couldn't call you, Jeff.
No.
Because, well, how the hell do I know?
Right.
And so Peter has been very careful and very cautious with this. And he attributes them a number so that if you're curious about a fly, he can go pull up the number and get you the dressing, but makes no state to, Marty Keene, the famous rod collector and tackle purveyor from Massachusetts. He's been gone these many years now, but he had one. He broke it, an enormous collection back in the early 90s. And there was one fly in there that was just absolutely stunning. It lives in the museum down the street now. It's an unknown fly, but he asked his wife which of these flies was her favorite. And her name was either Lillian or Lilith. And she said, oh, I love this one. So he named that Lil's Choice. And to the day, today, people will still come and say, do you have a dressing for Lil's Choice? And we're like,
I follow.
Nobody does.
No.
So that it just becomes,
yeah.
We made that mistake in the book when we photographed. We didn't think we were making a mistake, but assumptions get made. We photographed the Pink Lady. physically the very last fly she ever tied was a pink lady. And it resides down the street at the museum in the Classic. And when we had, it's a full page shot of this pink lady that she tied in the presence of H. Wendell Fulkins, who was the second owner of her business. And we, instead of saying, elsewhere in the book, it's called the pink lady, and there's the recipe. But on this page, we called it the Omega fly because it was her last fly. Omega. A little bit of Greek, people. Easy peasy, right?
Yeah.
Not so. Why is there no dressing for the Omega fly? Do you know the Omega fly is almost identical to the pink lady? Yeah, I'm kind of aware of that, actually. Yeah, thank you. And so in a couple of reprintings down, we had that struck. Because you get just tired of that question.
So you found maybe something was an inaccuracy. Or an assumption, I should say.
Well, who's making the assumption, right? It was the last fly that she tied. The assumption that we made that was false, and that people would understand the use of the word Omega as meaning the last.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, we never bridged that gap.
Right.
So so names are important. Names are really important, and you have to be careful how you use them.
So you mentioned something right there that is not obvious to the audience. So I have to ask you to clarify. You and your father bought Carrie Stevens fly tying company.
I did.
You did?
Yeah. Father always said he couldn't tie his own shoes.
So tell us about that.
So that ironically was in 96 as well. We had known H. Wendell Fulkins for years. And Wendell Fulkins, this is a little bit of backstory, was the man in 1954 that bought Carrie Stevens' business from her. Her eyesight was failing. She had macular degeneration. And they had left Upper Dam. They were aging out. And it was time for her to stop tying flies. And so George Fletcher, who was friends with H. Wendell Fulkin, who was already an established fly tyer, he said, Carrie, I think this guy's a good guy. And he's a good guy to pick up your business and carry the name forward. And she was like, oh, great. So she set up a meeting, and she tied the pink lady in his presence, the Omega fly. And he purchased the business from her in 54. And then in 96, Wendell's eyesight was failing out by.
What did he do with the company? From when he purchased it from her, did he continue to produce flies?
Oh, sure. He sure did. And he would tie all her patterns, and he made a bit of coin over the years doing these wonderful sets of like 19 or 20 of her patterns and selling them. Mm-hmm. And he was not as gifted a fly tyer as Carrie Stevens. Very, very, very few people are. So, it's very easy to distinguish Wendell's work from Carrie's work. There's no danger of confusing the two. He would also band the flies, as she did. He felt that was his right as he purchased the company.
Sure. Yeah.
And he had a beautiful card made up a little bit bigger than Carrie's card. And on it, he, tied by Wendell Fulkins, formerly made by Mrs. Carrie Stevens of Upper Dam, Maine. He had the presence of mind to use her name to further the sale.
And where was he located?
He lived in Tamworth, New Hampshire, on the Swift River.
Yep.
So he was a funny guy. He would tie in his bathroom on his toilet. He had this little fold-down table, and his wife had sequestered him in there. And she didn't like this stuff all over the house. And he would go in there and tie flies sitting on the commode. Yep. Pretty classy.
How did the conversation come about where you approached him or he approached you, or just word got out that maybe he was going to part from?
No, well, Dad and I were, the book was underway, and it was one of those situations where, I don't know, we wanted to have it, Did you
approach him? Or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. We were very friendly with largely because we'd bought, dozens and dozens and dozens of streamers. I mean, I have boxes of his slides, and, we were just friends, and we knew of his failing health, and he died 3 years after that. So yeah, it was just, hey, Wendell, what are you doing? He wasn't tying very much. He couldn't tie very well anymore. His eyesight was really failing.
But you didn't have illusions of becoming a commercial fly tyer. I think you wanted to buy it for provenance purposes.
No. Shits and giggles. It's fun thing to have. I feel a real strong connection to Mrs. Stevens and her work. And I had been a commercial tyer, and I quickly ascertained that was not for me. I do not want to tie you a gross of Hornbergs. No, thank you.
No.
So this suits me much better. I tie the occasional fly for sale, mostly to collectors and stuff like that.
With the success of the book, let's say, was there a point where it went out of production?
It is not. The publisher still has a case or two.
So if someone wants to buy the book, it's available.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But there was a period when they were not available, and this. We had gone through that first 4 printings, and I think the last one was like 1,000 books or something like that.
Can I tell you a story?
Yeah.
Bob Dion and I were running a small fly shop in Farmington. So just, 30 minutes down the road from Range. And so there's this funnel of people coming through at Christmas time, really all summer when you and your father first released the Carrie Stevens book. We couldn't keep them on the shelf. And so we were buying them from your publisher. We would buy 12 at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And 12 would go off the shelf faster than we believed that they would.
Cool.
And at Christmas time, they were becoming back order. We couldn't get them during the holiday season because they were so wildly popular in the fly fishing community. It was just a must-have, and it was the easiest gift you could give. So again, to speak to the surprise factor, I think it's a wonderful read. It's a wonderful book, and I couldn't put it down. And
thanks. There's a lot of love in it. Like I said, the driving force was the memory of my mother. The dedication is to Mom, and no one was more surprised than us, Mike.
Right.
Wow, people are actually interested in this.
So at that point, the other thing that was really going on, just in terms of you guys becoming recognized as maybe, we'll just say, the experts on Carrie Stevens, is you created a lantern in the dark where all the moths could bring their Carrie Stevens flies to, or bring something about Carrie Stevens to your light. Did you see people coming to you more, or did you see some opportunities to preserve more of Carrie Stevens' history and legacy following the release of the book?
Well, I suppose so. All of a sudden people started to reach out. Now there's book signings and speaking engagements and this TU chapter. We'd really love to hear you come and talk and show your collection and all that. So that put us really in touch with like physical folks and their passions. So we really knew then that wow, this isn't just a weird thing. People really, really enjoy this topic. And that's really, what more does a writer want than to have other people feel similarly to the work they've done, or written about. These things take on a life of their own with, chat rooms and collections of fishing groups and people getting together and doing their own thing with them. And that's cool. And there's enough of a topic here now.
Yeah.
I think there's 90 flies or so in the Carrie Stevens book.
Yeah.
And there weren't that many published prior to that. A lot of those were the first time they came to light. So now there's this great body of work for other people to work on, like Peter Simonson and all the other collectors. And you kind of get a sense that maybe you just kind of uncorked the gene there.
Right.
I think
when
it's been a lot of fun.
When you and I talked before today, and we were just anticipating this conversation, you said that on the surface, Carrie Stevens was really just a fly tyer. But you've learned so much more about what her life was like in the process of doing all the research you and your father have done. Tell us about her.
Well, by all accounts, she was an incredibly congenial person. People almost always liked her very much. She married kind of young to Wallace Stevens, and they moved to Upper Dam. And it seems to me, a lot of this personal stuff is conjecture, right? That she absolutely loved it there.
Loved it at Upper Dam.
Yeah.
Living there.
Yeah. I get the sense that it was her home.
Yeah. And in the book, you talk about her perennial gardens, and she had a white-tailed deer that she had a bell around its neck.
Yeah.
Someone could shoot.
Yeah.
She did love it there.
I always wondered what happened to that deer.
Well, it probably died of old age, really.
Yeah.
But it comes out in your writing that she really did have. I mean, it was probably her safe place. It was probably.
Yeah. And, you know, as happens a lot of times in tourist meccas like Upper Dam was, if you're any kind of people person at all, you're going to start to form relationships with the people who come to visit there. And she did this. You know, we talked earlier about the Bartlett family.
Right.
G. Donald Bartlett had a daughter. Her name was Lucy. And Lucy was actually one of our person-to-person contacts with someone who knew Carrie Stevens, that we were able to have a relationship with. And she gave us all these wonderful anecdotes of when she was a little girl. And she had a birthday one year while at Upper Dam, and Carrie baked her a cake. And, was just very kind to the children that would come, because there weren't a lot.
And she didn't have children.
No, she was childless. Her Welch was childless. Gardner Percy had a child, thank goodness. That's going to help. But no, she didn't have any children. And, I've always speculated about that. I mean, there's any number of reasons. But everyone just really has these really positive, warm things to say about her. This year is the 100th birthday of the Gray Ghost, as it's come to be known.
Right. So 100 years ago in 1924, and I think it'll be, what's the date? Do you remember?
July 2nd.
July 2nd.
Right.
And that's also in Maine recognized by Governor Curtis to be
Carrie Stevens Day.
Carrie
Well,
Stevens.
that's August 15th.
Okay, so they picked a different date.
Yes, they did.
Okay.
Yeah, they did. And she died just days before that. So she wasn't able to partake in that at all. But no, and as the legend goes, right? As the legend goes, as the story goes, on July 2nd, 1924, she put aside her housewife duties. I think that's how it was written up.
Yes.
And being inspired, she crafted this new fish fly and ran quickly to the Upper Dam pool, where she cast and caught the famous 6-pound, 13-ounce trout that became the stuff of legend. And really, with that trout and that submission, she won second place in the Field and Stream contest of the year, and received all the recognition for it, and a beautiful Lynn Bogue Hunt painting as her prize, a cited prize.
And that trout was stuffed in terms of taxidermy.
Yes, by her Welch.
By her Welch.
Yeah.
Who we will talk about
We will
in a second podcast.
at a later date.
There's just too much,
Yeah.
we could continue
We
to go
may need two for her alone.
for Herbola.
Yeah. So for everything that for all the information we struggled to obtain about Miss Stevens, because she was such a private person, and it was really just the flies, and that wasn't quite enough of the story. You wanted to bring, the region and the fish and the people into that story as well.
Right.
And that fleshed out very nicely. But the opposite was true for her Welch.
Right.
Stuff had to stay on the cutting room floor.
Tell-
There was just so much information.
But look, going back to Carrie, let's talk about Wallace.
So Wallace Stevens, her husband, he was a bit her senior when they wed. I think by as much as about 18 years or so. He was a guide of some repute, and he focused primarily on Upper Dam and the Richardsons. He kind of got he got really good clients, like most notably Shang Wheeler, right? The famous decoy carver and statesman from Connecticut. And he is the guide right out of Central Cast.
Right. And so as a successful guide, guiding the upper crust of New York City and Boston, all of a sudden with Carrie's success with the Gray Ghost and the introduction of this fly that seems to be like lightning in a bottle, her fly tying business explodes.
It did take off really well. First at the Upper Dam Hotel, and then through Herb Welch as a merchant.
But also
on this
you
side
could-
of the lake. But she was also selling, people were writing her, and she was selling flies across the nation.
Yeah, and in your book, you curate some of the letters that are in the book
Mhm.
from potential buyers saying, we would like to,
Yeah.
You know.
I need a half a dozen green beauties
yeah,
to take up to the Miramichi, or, can you provide me with this by such and such a date? And, that's pretty telling.
do you remember
Huh?
your father, or do you remember these things coming to you, or how did you?
Yeah, sometimes they're indelibly etched in memory. One of the really big coups that we pulled off was the obtaining the Austin Hogan manuscript. So Austin Hogan, I'm sure you're familiar with
No,
him.
just for the audience, define who that is.
So Austin Hogan was a gentleman from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he was an artist and a historian and a rod maker, and just any number of things related to this world that we're talking about. But Austin was first and foremost a researcher, and he had started to compile some of the very early work on Mrs. Stevens and her methodology, what she used for materials, how she obtained those materials, all of this stuff. And we always build on the works of others, right? Facts of others. So he had established this manuscript. And, Joseph Bates gets a lot of the credit, and justifiably so, for bringing a lot of Mrs. Stevens' works to light and talking extensively about her and her place at Upper Dam and in the fly fishing community. He talks about that in Streamers and Bucktails and Streamer Fly Tying and Fishing, which are almost the same book. So he got there first, but Mr. Hogan's manuscript never really saw the light of day. It was compiled, I think, largely for himself, and there remained, but we were able to obtain that.
And what was in it?
Well, just the finest of notes. Examples of her constructed wings, physical examples, shoulders and wing feathers and cheeks glued together, set, ready to go. I need a half a dozen gray ghosts. Boom, she goes and grabs the wings that she'd spent an afternoon assembling at some previous date.
Right.
And probably most importantly, certainly to me, because you could infer a construction method just by reverse engineering the fly.
Yes. Yeah.
Which we actually have done a couple of times to audience, which is a funny thing to do in front of people, to deconstruct Carrie Stevens' fly and watch the gasp audibly. But they're always compromised to some degree, so that makes them uncollectible, like a broken hook, end of design going. Nothing to me with a broken hook.
So that would be one to untie.
Right.
Yeah.
And also one that was given to us.
Right.
Not one of ours. But, Mr. Hogan did this incredible amount of documentation on patterns and on the construction and the materials, so he wrote recipes.
Mhm.
And forgive me, I can't remember them now specifically, but several of them were patterns that we had been dying to learn about.
Right.
We talked a little bit about unidentified patterns.
Yes.
Well, there was also the inverse was also true. We would have a recipe and a name for a fly and no physical example.
But that's where you came in.
Well, that's one thing, but to see it in the inventor's hand, from the inventor's hand, is quite another.
Right.
So, and Mr. Hogan provided a lot of that, because you'd be like, what? That's crazy. I've heard of that.
So I think that the success of the first publication of Carrie Stevens really must have set you and your father up to take on the next publication 18 years later, which was Her Welch.
Well, Father had, he wrote a biography on Stan Bogdan in between there.
I didn't know that.
Yes. And that's what kind of held off. We were going to launch right into her, because in acquiring all of this information on Carrie Stevens, there's lots of overlap. You learn a lot of things about other people in other places simultaneously. And, Herb lived just down the street, and Herb was a well-documented figure, magazine articles. He was a radio guy, all that stuff. So he was then presented with the opportunity to write the biography on Stan Bogdan, which you do not turn down.
No.
So he did that.
Were you involved in the Stan Boggin project?
Peripherally. I tied a few flies.
Yeah.
Our son had just been born. I launched my own business. We just bought a home. Things, our universe was a little different than it was when we were writing Carrie. But I got shit under control by the time it came around to help with her. And he also published several magazine articles in there for the American Museum of Fly Fishing, Gray Sporting Journal, Sporting Classics. He wrote pretty extensive.
Your father really had a prolific writing career when it came to fishing.
Yeah.
Legacy and history.
Hook and bullet press. You
Yeah.
love that term. Hook and bullet press.
We still use that term today.
You know?
We do. Tell us about you, because we haven't really talked about you as a person outside of fly fishing. Well, let's not talk about fly fishing. Let's just talk about. So you mentioned that you do flooring.
Yep. Currently, I own my own business. I'm a wood flooring contractor, and I specialize in antique homes. We live in Ipswich, Massachusetts.
Sure.
Which is old as dirt.
Yeah.
And we have 59 first period homes that I didn't set out to become a specialist in that period of construction.
How did you learn about it?
From just your first call to a home that was built in 1650. And there are some unique situations that come about with framing and milling, and there's really no other way to learn that stuff.
Did you have any formal training?
When I was a younger man, I apprenticed with a flooring contractor off and on. I worked with him off and on for about 9 years.
And cooking is another one of your passions.
Well, that was the other thing that was going on simultaneously. I mentioned I worked for him off and on.
Yeah.
So yeah, my wife and I both were chefs for a long time.
Specialty?
Not really.
No?
Situations, you have to be very adaptable. It's not a season of the bear, so to speak, where I ended up my career was probably my favorite cooking, which was in Greek Mediterranean.
Oh, yeah.
It's a wonderful cuisine.
So were you working in restaurants? Did you start your own restaurant? Or
no, we never. People would always say, when are you going to open your own restaurant? And we were like, the day after, never.
Yeah.
It was a foolish thing to do, own a restaurant.
Yeah.
It was never for us. We ran restaurants.
Yeah.
The back of the house, but we never owned. We were spared that foolish.
So you're working down in Massachusetts and then coming home to Maine.
Well, yeah. So, the cooking career was really interesting. So I said sometimes I would work sporadically with that flooring guy.
Mm-hmm.
So in season, from like May to October, for years and years, Suzanne and I worked at Grant's Camps up in Kennebago. And for the last 2 years, I was the chef there. We worked there for 3 seasons. And she was in the kitchen and out on the floor. And so there was that. I love that period of my working life because it was this beautiful intersection with all of the things that I loved to do.
Right.
I was still very enamored of food, of the industry at that time. And then, of course, working at Grant's Camps behind the gate in Kennebago got us incredible access to such really hallowed water. And we made friends that we're still, really close with today during that time period. That was 92, 93, and 94.
So that was before the book.
Oh, well before.
But that was when you guys were doing a lot of your work.
I remember, and it was well known that I was researching Carrie Stevens. That had been going on for years up here. And there was the guides would always eat in the kitchen. It was frowned upon for guides to eat in the dining room with the guests. Occasionally, a guest could make a request, but it was very seldom. And I don't think the guides particularly cared for it anyway, but they would always honor the sport. But there was a guide up there, a man from Phillips named Ray Ellis. And, it's hard to throw a rock around here and not have it hit an Ellis. And Ray was a real, real beautiful guy and knew of my interest. And he said, why don't you, after lunch one day, after I fed him, before he went out for the afternoon, he said, why don't you follow me to my truck? And I did. He was parked up the way. And he reaches in the back of the truck, his little old Toyota pickup, and pulls out a wallet that was wet, like he had used it. It had probably landed on the bottom of the boat, of the Rangeley boat that day. And Grant's fleet of Rangeley boats were well seasoned at that point in their life. little bit of moisture.
Translation, long in the tooth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he reached right in there and he pulled out 3 Carrie Stevens flies from his wallet, his working wallet. And he said, why don't you choose one of these flies? And one of them was a bucktail. Now, in our collection, we had not seen a Carrie Stevens bucktail at this point. And,
All featherwing.
all hairwing.
All hairwing. Sure.
Yeah. And
No, I'm saying what you had. You had been collecting.
yes, everything else were the classics.
Had
you
not
know.
seen it.
Yeah, hadn't seen her bucktail work. Knew that she was reported to have done them.
Yeah.
But he's like, "Oh, can I have that bucktail?"
Do you remember the pattern?
Oh, absolutely. It was an FRS fancy.
Yeah.
And Ray was like, "You want that one?" Because there was 2 others that were hit a gray ghost and I can't remember the third, but they were feather wings.
But you recognize the rarity.
Oh, I wanted that bucktail so bad. And he gave it to me.
Do you still have it?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, I want to, on behalf of the fly fishing community, want to thank you for the work you and your father did to chronicle Carrie. And I love how you call her Mrs. Stevens. That shows the amount of respect that you have and have had for her. And I think it's just so wonderful to sit down and listen to you explain the backstory behind the book and also a little bit about the work that you and your father did. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It was so nice to meet you. And thank you for bringing your beautiful dogs.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us for this intimate discussion. And thank you for listening to Flyline Podcast. A new Flyline Podcast episode will be released every 2 weeks on Tuesdays, so be sure to come back to meet our next famous guest. Until then, this is Michael Jones, and we invite you to visit the blog section of our website to enjoy photos and contributions from our guests and experience all of our episodes at flylinepodcast.com.